Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Blake here from ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be talking about the Taimanov variation of the Sicilian defense. So here we go, we're going to start out with an open Sicilian here. Black's going to play the line with the knight on c6, and after d4, takes, Black's just going to play pawn to e6. Unlike a lot of other Sicilians where Black plays d6 instead, Black's going to play e6 in this one, opening up the dark squared bishop, and in some lines this bishop even comes to b4 to pin a knight on c3. That really helps increase the pressure to White's center compared to a lot of other Sicilians. In general, Black's plan is to follow up with queen c7, just putting this queen on this open c-file, and also to watch out for this e5 square to stop an early e5 in some cases. That can be valuable because Black doesn't have that pawn on d6, so you always have to watch out for that early e5 advance. In fact, if Black didn't prevent it, and White was able to play a couple more moves, White could, for example, meet knight f6 with e5 at some point, and that would usually not be good for Black unless they had some tactic to win that pawn. So the queen's pretty good on c7. Let's take a look at an example of how the game could go. White most frequently plays knight c3 in this position. Black can go ahead with queen c7. Now you might think this queen is vulnerable to knight b5. We're going to come back and look at that idea, but often White just continues with development. And one idea White has is to play bishop e3 and go for the English attack, which is known from other Sicilians as well, like the Najdorf. But again, there's going to be a big difference here because this dark bishop is open. So let's take a look. Pawn to a6, just stopping knight b5 once and for all. Queen d2, knight f6, castle long. This is White's plan in the English attack. You just castle long. And you have the idea to attack on the king side with your pawns because your king is on the opposite side of the board. But here we see Black's idea. Black can play bishop b4, and now the e4 pawn is under attack. White can defend it with f3, which is a move they often want to play anyways in the English attack, because it's kind of a launching board for this g-pawn here. But now comes knight e5, and this queen is revealed on the c-file. This knight's under a lot of pressure, and Black could be threatening in some cases to double the pawns there around the white king. The downside of that, of course, is giving up this dark bishop is a big concession. This is Black's good bishop, and Black could be weak on the dark squares if they give up that bishop for a knight. One of the main lines here continues knight back to b3, just letting these major pieces keep an eye here on the d-file. One of Black's ideas might be to play d5 in some cases, and this is a very common break in the Sicilian. This is one of the reasons why Black was willing to give White this lead in development that White often gets in the Sicilian, because to get it, White had to trade off their d-pawn for Black's c-pawn, which gives Black this central pawn majority, and Black could eventually claim a space advantage after d5. But it's not that easy to get in, so in this position, Black could just march onwards with b5 towards the white king, potentially opening up a square here for the bishop. And now comes queen e1, and now we see one of the downsides of this bishop being on b4. There's actually some tactics Black has to watch out for. By playing queen e1, this is a very nice multi-purpose move by White. This queen might want to swing around to the king side to help in the attack, but also, because bishop takes d2 doesn't come with check anymore, White's actually threatening knight takes b5 to win a pawn. And of course, if Black took the white queen, White would take the black queen, and White comes out ahead. So that means this bishop's job is done on b4, it gets out of the way so the pawns can advance, White pushes forward on the king side and in the center, and we get a very dynamic, unbalanced position. Exactly what a lot of Sicilian players like. Let's show just one more example within this English attack setup, coming back here after White castles. Black doesn't always play bishop b4 because we see that bishop probably can't stay there for too long. Another idea here for Black could just be to play pawn to b5 and start getting those pawns rolling. Let's say f3, bishop e7, g4, White starts going for this pawn storm idea. Castles, g5, and in some lines of the English attack the knight goes to e8. In this particular case, the knight often comes to h5, just to kind of slow down White's pawn storm and potentially watch over this f4 square. I pulled a sample line here from my database because I thought it illustrated some of the ideas very well here. So White could play here knight e2. White's just regrouping a bit, watching over these squares, and they know this knight might get kicked away anyway, so they step out of the way. Rook d8, again, Black wants to play d5 and blow open the center. That would really reduce the effectiveness of White's attack here on the flank. Knight g3, of course White's happy if Black tries to win this pawn. That would blow open the h-file, very dangerous for Black. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and knight f4. h4, with this knight out of the way, White would love to push forward there on the king side. Bishop b7, and now a somewhat surprising move, queen b6. You know, often in the English attack you don't think of White wanting to trade queens, but here it works out tactically. The point is this bishop doesn't guard the d-pawn anymore, so if Black traded queens, then the rook would be under attack, And if the rook moved, then of course rook takes d7 would be very strong for white. So black can't actually trade queens here. Queen back to b8. The king tucks itself away on b1. And now comes black's pawn break with d5, striking at the white center. And of course we're getting kind of far here from the opening, but I did want to show a couple more moves because this is a very tactical position. It looks like white can win material with bishop takes f4, but black had seen further than that. The point is, after black takes their piece back, white takes a piece. Now, of course, if black takes the knight, then white takes yet a third piece, and white stays up a piece. But the point is, the bishop can just save itself here. And now the knight's under attack, queen takes f3 is threatened, and this actually turns out okay for black. If white plays knight e2, for example, to avoid the rook fork, then surprisingly queen d6 is pretty strong, and this queen's almost trapped, even though white's up a piece. So some very interesting ideas there, but very much in the spirit of the English attack. White pushes forward on the king side, black tries to get counterplay on the queen side and in the center, and you can get some very interesting games. Alright, so we've seen what happens when white uses this English attack setup with bishop e3, queen d2, castle long, and trying to push on the king side. Let's consider some other possible setups that white could use here against the Taimanov, starting in this position here after queen c7. One is that white could just play bishop e2, which is usually associated with going for more of a kingside castling kind of setup. Let's say a6, castles, knight f6, black just develops like normal, and again we see how valuable it is that black controls this e5 square. It wouldn't be very pleasant for white if they could just be hit with e5. Let's say white could play knight takes c6 followed by e5, but here it's not going to work because of this queen on c7. So bishop e3, and now comes bishop b4 yet again, attacking this e4 pawn. And in this particular line, this is an interesting idea white has. White can play here knight to a4, trying to target this b6 square. This is a common theme in the Taimanov, as you might have gathered. You remember from that last game how white was able to infiltrate that square as well, and here white's trying to do it again, with the help of the e3 bishop. Of course, taking here on e4 would be pretty dangerous for black. White might have ideas like taking on c6, followed by knight b6 attacking the rook, followed by queen d4, forking the bishop, the knight, g7. Does not look fun. So instead, black usually retreats that bishop. Its job is once again done here on b4. It's kind of driven this knight to the rim, and it doesn't want to be a loose piece here in case of any tactics. So bishop back to e7, and now knight takes c6, followed by knight b6, as you might have predicted. Of course, black doesn't lose any material, though. We might see rook b8, knight takes, queen takes, bishop d4, and black could play c5 here, trying to expand a bit there in the center. Let's say bishop e5, rook b6, just watching out for this potentially vulnerable dark square here on d6. Black just wants to play d6 next and drive that bishop away. Queen d3, b6, bishop c3, castles, and white could play b3 here, trying to make this file not as dangerous by shutting down that rook on that file. As you see, this castle kingside setup usually leads to a more positional kind of game. Not as double-edged, of course, as the opposite side castling, but definitely still a very interesting game. Black still has this pawn majority here in the center, and black would love to push forward with d5 at some point and claim some central superiority there. So there's a sample of how the game could go in that bishop e2 line. Sometimes white plays f4 right away, just trying to make sure they get this space advantage over here on the center and on the king side, and make sure black at least has to worry about this e5 advance. For example, if black played knight f6 here, then e5 might be played, and that doesn't look very good for black. So let's say here a6. One of white's ideas might be to take on c6. Now, white has to be careful playing this move. They often don't want to do it, because this can help black bring another pawn closer to the center. That's why white didn't take there right away when they had the chance. But it can have its upsides as well. For example, if black just tried to play b takes c6, it'd be a bit hard for them to play d5 too early, because white's going to be ahead in development. White could quickly play bishop d3 and get castled, and black probably doesn't want to blow the center open before they castle. And furthermore, white might take the opportunity to play e5 at some point now with the help of this f-pawn here. And now if black ever wants to advance, white could just take on passant, the black pawns stay isolated here. So black might not be as keen as going for this kind of position with the big central pawn majority with b takes c6. So instead, let's say after knight takes c6 they just take with the queen. That's certainly also possible. We could see here bishop d3 just developing, pawn to b5, very common, expanding here on the queen side, hopefully trying to drive this knight away from its square here where it influences the center. White could play here queen to e2, bishop b7, bishop d2, bishop c5, black's developing actively as well. And this bishop controls a lot of squares here, so white might want to castle long. And once again, we might get an opposite side castling game. It should be noted, black rarely wants to castle queenside on any of these lines, just like they usually don't in the Sicilian, because the c-file is one of black's sources of counterplay. Black kind of wants to attack on the queen side and down the file. It's not too consistent with black's opening choice here to castle long, especially after playing a6 and b5. So we've seen how that line might look. Also, after queen c7, I mentioned we'd go back and talk about what happens if white just attacks that queen with knight b5. Now, usually this proves kind of fruitless because black can just play queen b8, still stay on this diagonal here, and this knight's just going to be kicked away. But if white has a very specific idea in mind, this line might still make sense, and this is what it is. White could play here bishop e3, and the idea is if black plays a6, they're not just going to move this knight away, they're going to play bishop to b6 right away and take up residence on this weak b6 square. And the idea is after black accepts this sacrifice and wins a piece, it's impossible to stop knight c7. You might think black's defenseless here, but black's main line here is to play bishop b4 check, swing around to a5, knight c7 still can't be stopped, but now black can get 3 minor pieces for the queen. Certainly a very interesting position here. This would be great practice for you if you want to set this position up against a computer and play it for both sides a few times. Good practice with assessing and handling material imbalances. Finally, there are a couple deviations that can happen before the main moves here are played, before knight c3 and queen c7 are played. So let's talk about what else white could play here. White sometimes plays knight b5 right away, even before the queen comes to c7. And I just found one sample line here. White's idea might be to just force black to play d6, and after d6, white can play c4, trying to go for this kind of hedgehog structure, trying to potentially pressure this weak d6 pawn on the open file. There's a few lines in the Sicilian that lead to this exact pawn structure here, with e4, c4 against d6, e6, and the ideas are mostly all the same. Black would love to break out of their shell one day and break with b5, or d5, or f5, whereas white's going to try to restrain all these pawn breaks and be happy with their space advantage. So I'm just going to pull one sample line here. Let's say knight f6, knight 1 to c3, a6, knight a3, bishop e7, bishop e2. Both players get castled. b6, very typical kind of hedgehog format here. Black's just going to develop within their first 3 ranks and hope to get one of those pawn breaks in after some careful preparation. Just to wrap up, let's say bishop e3, bishop b7, queen b3. Looks like this pawn could be a target. But black has everything under control. They can play knight d7, this knight might hop to c5 at some point, black could break with f5 at some point, and you get some very interesting games. Also, I did briefly want to show what happens if white just takes on c6 right away. I did kind of allude to that earlier. Here though, black can just take with the b-pawn, and after, let's say, bishop d3. By the way, it's worth noting, white can't play e5 yet. If you want to pause your video, think about what happens if white plays e5. Black just picks up a pawn, black just has queen a5 check with a simple fork. So let's say bishop d3, knight f6. Again, the knight can come here because black's not afraid of e5. So let's say castles, and now just d5, and black uses this c-pawn to help grab some more central space. Alright, thanks for watching everyone. Please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up. It's totally free. It only takes 5 seconds, and I'll send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you sign up. It took me way too long to become a chess master, and I want to help you do it in a fraction of the time. Thanks, and I will see you there.